For a country pretty much unanimously focused on a single subject, it's amazing the stuff we're forgetting, that we're just not factoring into the equation about why we ended up with this chicken-fried, petrified, run-and-hide economy. Apparently, we're supposed to think that nobody could have seen this coming.
I think some of the best financial minds in the country didn't see it coming.
No, we didn't see it coming.
But I don't really know of hardly anybody who, with the exception of a handful, that said, wait a minute, this thing is getting completely out of hand.
Who could have possibly seen this coming? Nobody could have seen it. It was totally unforeseeable. Force majeure. Join me now on a trip through the time machine. Going back to 1999. All right, 10 years ago, the year the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act was born. This bill was introduced by 3 Republicans, Graham, Leach, Bliley, and it removed a Great Depression-era regulation that had said that banks and investment banks and insurance companies all had to be separate. Graham, Leach, Bliley cleared the way for big financial companies to be all of those things wrapped into one. Big companies with huge internal incentives to take risks. Companies that were so complicated they couldn't really be regulated. And companies that were so big that the government felt that they could not be allowed to fail. At the time, in 1999, when this was being debated, Democratic Senator Byron Dorgan from North Dakota saw it coming. Like he should have a psychic show in Vegas level saw it coming. On May 6, 1999, on the Senate floor, Mr. Dorgan said, quote, "This bill will, in my judgment, raise the likelihood of future massive taxpayer bailouts." $1 trillion is massive, right? Well, to the New York Times on November 5th, 1999, Senator Dorgan said, quote, "I think we will look back in 10 years' time, and say, we should not have done this. But we did because we forgot the lessons of the past, and that which is true in the 1930s is also true in 2010. So here it is, 2009, and I'm thinking, dude, at the time we were worried about Y2K? Joining us now, Democratic Senator from North Dakota, Byron Dorgan. Senator Dorgan, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Rachel. How are you?
Great, thank you. You've been getting accolades in the blog world and now on this show for having been right in 1999 when you rang alarm bells over the deregulation. At the time when you were saying we're going to look back at this in 10 years and say this was a big mess, did you really foresee that there would be a crisis this big?
Well, I'm not necessarily sure I saw this big a crisis, but I said at the time to the banks, said, if you want to gamble, go to Las Vegas. I mean, this was not about a crystal ball. It was just common sense at the time. You know, in the 1930s, we saw banks merge with, real estate and security risks, and the whole thing collapsed. 20s and 30s, and so we put in place, I wasn't here, but we put in place laws like Glass-Steagall to prevent all of that. And then in 1999, we were told that's all old-fashioned. Let's strip that away and allow big financial holding companies one-stop financial shopping. And I thought it was nuts. I mean, how on earth could we forget the lessons that were so important, that we learned so well and with such pain about 7 decades prior?
10 years ago, when Graham-Leach-Bliley passed and gutted that essentially gutted Glass-Steagall, that important law that you just described, Lawrence Summers was Treasury Secretary at the time, and he said when that deregulation bill passed that it was historic legislation that would enable American companies to compete in the new economy. I have to ask you if it sort of freaks you out that he's now one of the main guys trying to get us out of the mess that this deregulation caused.
Well, I sat across the table from him at the White House 2 days ago. There's a culture, and the culture is that Wall Street knows best. There were only 8 of us in the United States Senate that voted no. This was a huge deal to repeal the protections that were put in place after the Great Depression. A huge deal. 8 of us voted no. This thing allowed these huge financial holding companies, allowed you to bring significant risk into the banks, and they just ran hog wild. And now we're in a situation in 2009 where we've seen this financial crisis and collapse, massive taxpayer bailouts. Now the question is, how do we put this back together and get out of this deep hole?
That's exactly right. And what's coming next is the discussion of not just how to rescue us, but how to put the financial system back together in a way that it doesn't happen again and that these lessons are learned. I was struck in looking at the New York Times coverage of Graham-Leach-Bliley passing in 1999. Phil Gramm of Texas, who wrote that bill, said, we have a new century coming. We have an opportunity to dominate that century the same way we dominated this century. Glass-Steagall came at a time when the thinking was that government was the answer. In this era of economic prosperity, we've decided that freedom is the answer. That was what he said in 1999 when this passed. We know what the disastrous results of that were. Who is going to lead the cause, I think, of convincing the American people and really convincing Congress that we sort of need to believe sometimes that government is the answer? There's a philosophical status of this legislation as well as just a strategic one.
Well, and the other thing, immediately after this legislation passed, it stripped away all those protections and allowed all the big banks to marry up and decide that they loved each other and wanted to get together and merge. Immediately after that, George W. Bush came to town as a new president, and he hired regulators who were willing to boast about being willfully blind. They didn't want to regulate. They said, you know what? It's a new day. There's a new sheriff in town. The sheriff's not interested in watching what you do. And the result is we saw, all of these credit default swaps and CDOs, all these exotic financial instruments, these derivatives. In 1996, I wrote the cover story for Washington Monthly magazine on the subject of derivatives and pointed out there were tens of trillions of dollars of derivatives out there. The title of my cover story for the Washington Monthly magazine was Very Risky Business. And I had 4 different bills to try to regulate derivatives and hedge funds. I hope now perhaps most people will understand, and the Congress and I think the American people understand, we need regulation. It's not a 4-letter word. We need effective regulation.
I have this kooky idea that people who were right when everybody else was wrong and we did the wrong thing, I have this kooky idea that the people who were right are the ones who should be allowed to decide what happens next time. So could you sort of be in charge of figuring out what regulations we need the next time around when this comes up in the Senate in a couple months?
I'd be happy to.
All right.
I'll be happy to, but let me tell you what else we need. We need a select committee of the United States Senate with subpoena power that gives us the narrative of what happened so that everybody understands what happened. We need a financial crimes prosecution task force down at the Justice Department right now working on these issues. And we need to restore a portion of the Glass-Steagall Act to say to banks, you're over here and the riskier things are over here, and we're not going to bring you together again. Never again.
Democratic Senator from North Dakota, Byron Dorgan. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show, sir. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Rachel. Enjoy your show.